Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. I'm delighted to be joined by Tim Perdion. Great to talk to you again, Tim. Looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you, Simon. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So, um, t last time we spoke, since last time we spoke, Tim was telling me that he's been listening to some of the other episodes of the podcast back to back. So been a real deep dive into that. And this stuff is deep, right? It is deep, and it is the road less traveled.
Mm,
I think. I think. Um,
absolutely.
so the question, as you spotted, that I always ask, I always start with, well, I start with it slightly differently sometimes these days. Does To what extent does this word healing resonate with you, Tim?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a great place to start. And healing to me is a journey. And I would say that um, for me, the disruption that started a process of desiring to get healing was disruption related to anger. And so therefore that was some signs that there was distress and there was a need for healing. And so that started for me about 10 years ago. And so 10 years into the journey, it is a daily process, continuing to pursue healing to really continue to look within and understand what are all those spots, those parts, so to speak, within me that we're holding on to anger. Some of it's in the subconscious, some of it's below the surface of that consciousness, and yet very clear at times when reactions to things were bigger than maybe the events required. It was okay. There's more there, and so healing is a journey, and it's a journey to understand self. But also to understand the history or the circumstances of my childhood, and even as I've met both biological parents to understand their stories. It's a really big puzzle, so to speak, and putting the pieces together starts to help with all the questions. So for me, healing is a journey of understanding, but then also acceptance of all the different things that come up and minimizing resistance to things that can't be changed.
Wow. Yeah, you gave me a lot to dive into there. Um, which bit? So you covered a whole load of different stuff. Um, why don't I ask you a slightly different question? What particular healing moments come to mind
Yeah.
for you? Because we've done macro, so let's go micro.
Yeah. Yeah. So if the first signs that I had the awareness that I needed healing were related to anger, it was explosive anger directed at people that weren't really the people that hurt me. And so I started to hurt people that were close to me. And I just knew that that wasn't okay. So I asked for help. And I ended up going to get some help at a trauma and rehabilitation addiction center. And so for me, healing from anger, outburst of anger. And so under the surface was the anger, and all the different ways I was trying to cope were maladaptive and they weren't working. So the starting point for me was recognition that there was something that needed to be done to address this under the surface anger that started to kind of spill out.
Yeah. Um, so it's that. Is that what you've heard this term coming out of the fog? Is
Yeah.
that what? Is that your moment of coming out of the fog, do you think?
Well,
Or one of them, maybe?
I would say that this was even prior to me digging into the impact of my adoption. So I went to, in 2019, at 50 years old, I went to a place to dig into trauma, to dig into addiction, to dig into failed relationships, to dig into all the symptoms that later, when I came out of that place, I came into, I heard about the book, The Primal Wound. And so in 2020, when I read that book, I had already dug into trauma, but now I saw it from the through the lens of, oh, my adoption and the impact of that was really the root cause, so to speak. And so I started to dig into that. And that's when I first heard the term fog in coming out of fear, obligation, and guilt. And I started to realize that's really what had ruled my life, was being in thick fog.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think there's two ways that people, adoptees see, or everybody sees this fog thing, right? So, um, I there's the way that you've said, right? Fear, obligation, and guilt, and then there's another way that we sometimes express it, and I think this is probably closer to the way that I see it, is when we become aware uh, of the relinquishment trauma. So when the fear, sorry, when the subconscious relinquishment trauma becomes conscious. So it's that moment of seeing the cause, um, and that those two feels different to me. Coming out
Mm,
of fear,
mm,
obligation, and guilt,
mm.
and becoming aware of the trauma. But I'm wondering, do you see those two things differently?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because the impact of the relinquishment becoming from the subconscious to conscious, I think, was really profound for me. And it's related to the anger. So what happened? I'll just give you an example. I'm I'm at work, and um, I'm on a project, and one of the leaders of the company had a really strong opinion about how we should do something in the project. And so it wasn't a matter of we had a difference of opinion on the outcome. We were clear on the outcome, but the way he thought we should approach it was different than mine. And so he said, I think A, and I was interested in saying, hey, but what about B and C? And there was a moment where he kind of said my way or the highway. And it was, well, if you don't want to do A, then I'll find somebody else. And I found like that was the finger that poked the wound of I don't matter. And when he did that, I just felt a intense rush of energy come over me, and it was rage. And you know, the fight, flight, or freeze, I froze because I knew that if anything came out of my mouth, it was not going to be good for the situation, for my career, all that. So I froze. Fast forward, I'm on a vacation a couple weeks after that. So that one got my attention. And I'm on a vacation and I have an incident where I'm attending to my daughter who bumped her nose in the pool. She's about 10. You know, there's a cut. I'm trying to help her. First, my wife comes up and she expresses some concern, and my daughter's reaction is mirrored, and so she's getting all worried. And then her sister, my ex-wife's sister, came about and tried to attend to my daughter, and her expression was even more expressive. So my daughter gets really upset because she sees the reaction, and I'm trying to diffuse this, and I erupted. And I basically erupted on my sister-in-law, And again, with some reflection, I've said, okay, this is another instance where I had the situation handled, and two people looked like I didn't even exist, and I felt invisible. And again, it was that I don't matter. And this was a repetitive theme around that time. And both times anger came up. One time I froze, another time I let it out. And within a week, I was in a facility because I had to do something. So that was where those subconscious wounds became conscious for me, and they came out in really destructive ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I can definitely relate to those, and the, that I don't matter thing.
Yeah,
I've never heard it expressed quite like that.
yeah,
But I think it's a really, I think it's another great summation, right?
yeah. And I can tell you,
Summation.
I didn't know this at the time, but this is with reflection, this is with work, this is with really understanding the fog, understanding those repressed emotions, understanding anger is here to teach us something. And as when I go to the rehab place, they give us this feelings wheel, and anger's the secondary emotion, and beneath that is betrayal and resentment and disrespect and violation and fury and skepticism and numbness and withdrawn and all those other things. And so I started to learn my life was built on trying to repress all of those emotions related to that relinquishment that were in the subconscious.
Yeah. So you're saying you spotted that anger was a teacher, but it
Yeah.
didn't feel like that at the time, right?
Right. Right. Yeah, it felt like a weapon.
I heard something. I mentioned this on a podcast I recorded yesterday. I heard the name of a Gabor Mate program a couple of months ago called "The Wisdom of Trauma,"
Yep.
and to me, the wisdom of trauma and anger as a teacher seem to be kind of on the same vibe.
Yep.
And it's actually, rather than pushing our anger away, saying this is an anger, is this something that is destructive, that anger becomes constructive.
Yeah. Well, stay with the theme of healing, and we have to feel our feelings in order to heal from them. And so there's no way to healing without going through understanding what those emotions, particularly anger, are here to teach us. And I know that I grew up where people in my house were uncomfortable with emotion, expression of emotion, and so we didn't have a lot of conflict unless there were blowups. But I was taught that it wasn't okay to be angry. So I had to take whatever emotions I had and stuff them down and stuff them down. And it's like a pressure cooker. They don't go anywhere other than inside, and they're going to come out at some point. And I'm sure you've heard hurt people, and those kinds of things. Well, those cliche sayings become cliches because they're true.
Yeah.
And so the only thing that could happen at some point in my life was all the stuff that had been stuffed out. It was like, well, it's just a matter of time when that's coming out.
So, how would you describe your relationship with trauma, and
Mm.
changes in that relation and the changes in that relationship since then?
I've had to befriend it, so become comfortable with it and to accept it and to realize that it's there, and to be more aware of what are those types of triggers that might trigger it. But as also having done a lot of work, it's release. like trying to release it through EMDR work or through, talk therapy is okay, but I've done a lot of other types of things. And then also learning skills around breathing, meditation, prayer, different ways of reflecting, the impact of exercise. So part of it is to say, here somatically are some things I can do to help release more of that out of the body, because again, the body keeps the score, and recognizing just how uh, that body mind connection and the way body gets stored, trauma gets stored in the body. So it's really having that understanding and then saying, hey, what are the things I can do to ensure I continue to release that, become more aware of what those triggers are. And, it's how do you have that pause button so that I become more response oriented versus reactive?
But it's kind of a, it's a fairly new thing, a fairly rare thing for me to hear somebody say befriending our trauma.
Mm. Yeah. Well, maybe that just means I had to have a relationship with it versus being angry again that it was there. Because it's part of it is learning that you can't change the past, can understand it, can change the future. But if I don't make friends with my past in some way of accepting it, well, and I have a long history of repeating the past. So part of it was to say, let's honor it, let's understand it, let's release what we can. And then it's to begin the process of repairing the relationship I had with myself, because so much of my life was self sabotage or self hatred, self loathing, and using drugs, alcohol, and other means of coping with that. And that didn't work. So part of it is to say, I have a past. These are things that happened. And so acceptance, and then really forgiveness, and forgiveness of self and others who were part of my life. So that's been a process. So yeah, I don't, if that's making friends with it, not to say that I love it, but it's there to be dealt with.
Yeah. So you've used the term self-sabotage then, right? The
Yeah.
phrase self-sabotage, but you talked about understanding self a little bit earlier. Um,
Yeah.
are you meaning the same self, or is that different selves?
Well, there are multiple selves, right? I think, having done some parts work, recognizing that there are various parts inside, like my one therapist kind of said, imagine a boardroom and now invite all the different parts. And so there are multiple selves. There might be a self from pre-birth. There might be a self from birth, subconscious parts of the self, but there might be a self from 3 years old, or 8 years old, or middle school age, or high school, or so there's lots of parts, and each one of those parts for me has represented a time where something traumatic might have happened, or a reenactment of something from the past might have happened again and left a mark, right? And so those parts had a purpose, but mostly to survive and mostly to protect. So recognizing and honoring that their services were useful at a time, but at my age now, that 3-year old acting like a 3-year old doesn't serve me well. So the way I've worked through that is to kind of try to integrate all of that so that I can be a person who is not separate like that with all those different alienated parts.
Yeah. That the book, the No Bad Parts book.
Mm,
Parts work is also known as IFS.
yep, I have.
Listeners, in case you didn't, same thing. Um, and that book, the title says it all. I think
Yeah,
no bad parts.
yeah,
and it keeps on coming up and again and again. It seems to be one of the that and EMDR and body keeps the
Mm.
score and all those. They keep on coming up again, again and again.
Yeah.
And there's an incredible power there. He also he talks about the uppercase S self as well, though, doesn't he, Dick Schwartz? The kind of uh,
The higher self.
the higher self, the
Yeah.
true self, the
Yeah.
the the when it comes to adoption trauma, relinquishment trauma,
Yeah.
and the primal wound. I think of this as kind of the as the unwoundable self.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is the way I've seen it described as a visual that says the true self is the ball in the middle, and then all of the layers on the outside are those parts. And then the ideal self is a ring around the outside of all that, which is the perfect self, the self, and what happens is if my true self has all those parts, I've always got that ideal self. And if everything that I experience is measured against that ideal self, I'm going to be disappointed because that's perfection. So it's interesting because you'd say that that highest self might be connected to the divine and whatever that means for people. Could be the part that's connected with the universe or God or whatever. I believe it's God, but other people believe different things. But the work then is to say, who is that true self? What is my identity? Because my identity is what I was created to be before I came out and then was exposed to all the things that created those parts. So if we are all born with a unique purpose and then we get born, and then part of our birth was relinquishment, well, the circumstances were changed and now there's separation from our true unique self. And we find a journey of trying to figure out how to get to that true and unique self, but it's weaving in and out of all that stuff that happened. And for me, that's been a long journey of like just figuring out all of those different parts. What were the different things? And I'm sure you've kind of talked with people about like what was it like in utero? Because there's one of your guests might have even said like there's never really a story where somebody who gave their child up for adoption had a very easy pregnancy, right? It was traumatic, the circumstances, the environment, all those different things cause, and again, being like someone said it on one of the shows I listened to, pickled in cortisol, which I love because that gives a good visual of all of the cortisol released and I'm pickled in that. Well, guess what I come out with? I come out with a marinated being and is marinated in, cortisol. So lots of ways of looking at all of this, but the journey to get to what that true self is a navigation process through all of those different parts.
Do you do you see that essential self as unwoundable, or how do you see it? I was talking to a fellow doctor
Yeah.
last night about this very subject, but it wasn't actually a live for a podcast. It was another conversation. So um, I'm very interested in hearing your metaphor of that and
Hmm.
your thoughts on that.
Well, I believe that we were so if my identity is not in what I do, what I achieve, who I please, what I'm in control of, all of that, if my identity is defined by whoever created me, and in my instance, I would say that my identity was given to me by God, that is my perfect self. And so I would say, what does he say? What does the creator say about me to give me clarity on that authentic self? Well, he doesn't say anything about wounds. He doesn't put the spirit of fear in us. He doesn't wound us. He says, you are a child made in my image. You are accepted. You are adopted into my family of people. And so you have a unique purpose. You are empowered. You are a new creation. You are never alone. You are being transformed. And the transformation is whatever happened, happened. But now, as you believe and start to really identify with who you are, whose you are, not just who you are, I do believe that purest form of our true self is unwoundable.
Yeah. The way I see it is it's a separation between who we are and how we feel. So
Yeah.
if we talk about trauma in in really simple terms, to
Mm.
me, it's a feeling rather than a thought,
Hmm.
right?
Yep.
But there's some thoughts around it too, but it's more of a feeling. So it man it like you talked a lot about anger, and I concur with that. As a guy, I would say that my trauma was often does often is manifested often uh, in anger and defensive anger in
Mm.
the way of uh, you're saying you don't you somebody else is saying that I don't matter.
Mm.
Just hold on. Sorry about that, ladies and gents. We had Amazon at the door, and I didn't realize that my wife was already in home. So she's dealing with them, right? So yeah, like I don't matter. There's
Yep.
and I can see that now with I don't matter, uh, and I can like in restaurants.
Mm.
There's been I don't matter, or what I want doesn't matter.
Yep.
And I can see the flip side of that as well. The feeling the feeling of being looked after,
Hmm.
the feeling of being um, warmly welcomed
Yeah.
into a restaurant. So I can see the flip. So if we say that if I say that anger to me seems like a sorry, trauma seems is often for me comes in the shape of anger.
Mm.
Anger is a feeling. I'm separating in my head, right? I'm separating a feeling from a being, right? So I'm separating how I feel from
Yep.
who I am,
Mm.
and and hence a relationship with trauma, right?
Mm.
So a relationship is only possible if there are two things, two people.
Yeah.
So a relationship with trauma means a disidentification from it. Yeah. And so I'm saying how I feel isn't who I am, or the
Right.
trauma that I feel isn't who I am. I'm separating
Yep.
feelings from identity. So I'm doing this in a kind of a
Yeah.
non-God thing, in a non-God method.
Well, so when you take the example of a restaurant and you go in and somehow you get the feeling that I don't matter because I'm not getting the attention or the service I expect. What does that poke at within me that brings up a reaction? It pokes in me something in a developmental stage of my life where somehow I didn't get a need met. And so I formed this opinion that they should be treating me a particular way. And when they don't, then it triggers that feeling of I don't matter when in fact, we don't know what the circumstances are or any of that. So part of that is to be clear about like, why do I feel that way? And I read this book recently called Unoffendable. And just imagine a world where nothing bothered us. Well, if we lived our lives perfectly, then nothing would bother us. But there's only one person who's represented themselves in the world who have lived a perfect life, and that was Jesus. He didn't sin and all that. So those imprints of our childhoods are really deep. And so therefore, when you don't get the treatment that you think you deserve in a restaurant, you feel a particular way, you then might tell a story about who I am and that I don't matter versus saying, hold that thought captive, test it with the truth of who I know I am, a divine child of the universe or whatever. So I've got to, like you said, I got to separate and realize the circumstances, environments never have an impact on who I truly am. My reaction could interpret those in a particular way, but it's nuanced, right? It's very nuanced and it gets deep. And I think my understanding also of complex trauma and of the different types of things related to childhood emotional neglect that have deep imprints on why we do what we do and all that are on top of those bigger unconscious wounds from relinquishment, right? Because I grew up in a house where, you know, I felt controlled. I felt like I had to live the life the way my adoptive parents wanted me to. And I think they were living out of fear. And so they wanted to control. And so you just see this pattern that creates that conditioning. And until you bring it to the consciousness, like we talked about earlier, until you bring this to the consciousness, it's like, oh, now I can see why, because now I see the wounding that they received in their own childhoods, right? And you just see these patterns that repeat themselves until somebody says, wait a minute, let's bring all this to the level of consciousness and start to say we have agency over how we handle this stuff. And that's what breaking cycles is all about.
I love it. I love it. I love it, Tim. Um, the the adoptee that I was talking to last night, Lena, who was on the podcast last week, a couple of weeks ago, um, she was expressing how difficult she believes it is for us to see this unwoundable, yeah, that our unwoundable essence or nature, um, characteristic. I don't know. I don't know how I would. What other words I could use? What could you? What's helped you see that unwoundable essence?
Well, I think my understanding of like the impact of the different circumstances in my life would produce things like I'm not lovable.
Sorry,
So,
ladies and gentlemen, we had a bit of technical glitch there. For some reason, my internet is unstable today. Tim, sorry, I missed that.
well, I think my understanding of the unwoundable self was formed after I understood the wounds I received. And so I might have grown up with belief systems about I'm not lovable, I don't matter, I'm unworthy. Uh,
Thank you for your patience, ladies and gentlemen. Internet playing way haywire today. So, um, here we let's go for another go at this, Tim. Thank you for your patience too, right? Um, so, what has helped you see your unwoundability?
yeah. First, I had to identify the nature of the wounds and the beliefs associated with them. So, belief that I'm not lovable, I'm not acceptable, I'm unworthy, I'm inadequate, all those types of things that are lies. So once I understood the beliefs that were running my life, I had the opportunity to bring that to the level of consciousness and then change those belief systems. And when your subconscious is running the show, it takes a lot of effort, habit, creating new ways of thinking, prayer, meditation, all kinds of new ways of creating these new neural pathways to install new belief systems. And so, because I do subscribe to the teachings of Jesus in the Bible and all that, there's a lot of things in there. There's a lot of words that he has for us that basically say you are lovable, you are acceptable, you are worthy. So the truth is what I subscribe to, and my truth is what I can read in what the Creator says about His children. So it starts though with really becoming willing to actually shine the light on those negative belief systems.
Okay. I just want to take you back a step to something that I think I've mentioned on a podcast recently, but or might have just been another conversation with an adoptee, not a recorded one, right? So I saw something from Gabor Mate, and I'm not a big Gabor Mate fan, right? Nothing. It's just he talks some sense to me, but some of the stuff doesn't really land for me.
Mm,
This did, right? And it was something like um, we say, right? We say, I don't feel lovable, or we
mm,
say, I feel
mhm.
unlovable. That is not a feeling, it's a belief.
Right.
And for some reason, that really landed for me because the essential feeling that we have as adoptees is that we feel unlovable. And if we can see that feeling of unlovability is actually a belief in unlovability,
Mm,
then it becomes something that's somehow easier
mm,
to change. We can see through a belief. It's a lot easier for me, I think. It's a lot easier to see through a belief than it
mm.
is to see through a feeling, right?
Yeah. So I think that connects really well with like the residue of trauma in the body, which is more of a feeling thing. So, like, I know that, like, I spend a lot of time in my head, which is where the thinking works, and you got to connect with the body and the heart, which is where the source of emotion is. So, I think the belief system are thoughts that are just thought over and over and over and over again until they become a belief. So there's this like mind body connection that needs to kind of be integrated so that my heart is open. And one of the things for me that has been a process is getting in touch with the heart and softening the heart, right? So if I have a hardened heart because I didn't trust people, then I built a wall to protect myself, and people and build getting letting people close was scary. So I have to soften that heart in order for me to actually receive love, to receive good feelings, good emotions that are coming from other people, to, and that's got to be built on trust and safety, and that takes time. I don't know there's an adoptee who hasn't had issues with trust, right? Because so forgiveness is a way to get the forgiveness of self, right? We also tell the story that somehow, and this I think Nancy Verrier kind of points out, is like it's the bad baby syndrome. Somehow, I don't know, intellectually I know I wasn't responsible, but somehow I feel like I was the bad baby. That's why I was relinquished.
Yeah. Something that I'm seeing at the moment is that the the memory is a feeling, not a thought. So we think of a memory as something based in thought, but this is pre-thought. It's
Yeah,
it's pre-verbal anyway.
yeah.
Maybe thoughts are going on, but they've not got any
That doesn't
language.
develop until after 3 years old, I think, in terms of actually having the ability of retaining those kinds of thoughts. So yeah, I think you're in that. It's that pre-verbal, subconscious,
That
emotion-driven world.
some people say that pre-verbal and subconscious are the same thing. The reason it's subconscious is because we don't have words for it.
Yeah, yeah.
We have a few neuroanatomists and neuroscientists scientists on the show, and they'll say that subconscious. Well, traditionally when I think of subconscious, it means used to think of it as something that's buried, right? It's
Mm,
buried out of sight. And it's below my conscious radar, right? So it's at the back. I think of the back of the brain for that, right? But other people say now, right? Well, no, it's at the front of the brain, but it's just in the right hand side of the brain, and the right hand
mm,
side of the brain isn't the left hand side of the brain is the language center. So it's not that we're unaware of it; it's the fact that we can't put words to it,
mm,
and we can't put words to it because it is pre-words, and that's you talked about the efficacy of talk therapy. Um, so there's something really big for me around that's playing for me at the moment around this subconscious actually means pre-verbal.
mm,
Uh, and I don't know why that feels
mm,
big for me, but it feels big for me. Like, we're not. I put something out on the I put something out on the web on the Facebook or something, and it was something that I came up with a year ago. So we're not born believing that there's something wrong with us.
mm,
So it's a belief that we pick up along the way.
mm,
What if we could put it down? And there was a mixture of response to that, right?
mm.
How can I be with us? Well, I'm just asking the question, what if? I'm not saying you should. I'm not saying you should be. I'm not saying you should. I'm not saying we should. I'm not saying we should not be able to. We should be able to do that. I'm not. I'm not trauma blaming anybody.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, what if? What if?
So that somehow speaks into this notion of fixed mindset versus growth mindset, because that might speak to a person who might say, this is just how I am, which means I have a grip, really tight grip on the past, and I'm not willing to let go, versus I can let go of that and I can grow from that. I don't have to let that rule who I am. And
Yeah,
that starts with believing that I can change.
yeah. And I go back again to this idea that isn't it easier to let go of a belief than it is to let go of a feeling?
I think 100%.
Especially,
Yeah.
sorry?
I think
especially in the middle of
100%.
it,
Yeah.
right? If I have if you and I are in a restaurant together, right, and I get angry about the waiter uh, ignoring me, whatever,
Mhm.
and I'm angry, and then you say to me, just let it go, Simon. In that moment, I'm probably likely to find that kind of tough, aren't I?
Yeah, you might say, well, but I'm justified in feeling this way because you have a different history. Because my reaction to the same event could be based on my history, and it might not poke at a wound in me that I don't have, but that you have. So that's why people will have a different reaction to the same event. But if you then try to convince me of your righteousness and the anger that you believe you're justified in having, well, it's okay to have two different reactions to the same situation because we're unique and our experiences have been unique up until that point.
And arguing for my anger isn't going to bring me to peace, is it?
Right. So that's what righteous indignation or, justified anger or whatever, which is I'm holding on to my anger because I feel like I was slighted or I feel like I was offended. And that can get into this whole thing around the shadow, right? Because that's an indication of stuff in the shadow that's getting poked at. So I'm going to react to it. And that's something that I probably need to look and say, hey, that's a gift. My anger is always a gift for me to look within, not to try to change the behavior of somebody else.
Yeah. So that righteous anger piece can be something that gets in our way of the healing, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because how tightly I hold on to that determines whether or not I can let go of it. Like, am I loosening my grip? Like, and you might get into an exchange with somebody and somebody might be a little bit angry and in their anger they might try to tell you what you should do and they might be crossing a boundary and a reaction could be, hey, loosen your grip a little bit, like, you're coming on strong, I feel like maybe you're crossing the line, why don't you loosen your grip on that a little bit. And now you're shining a mirror onto somebody that they then have to look at their side of it. And that's what that would be. If you do that with gentleness and compassion, it'll go well. But if you hold it up and say, hey, you MFer, like, look in the mirror, like what so part of that is in that instance you mentioned in the restaurant, like, how willing are you to hear a perspective of somebody else who's experiencing the same experience but having a different reaction?
Yeah. So what else do you think has got in the way of your healing?
Well, there's so much in the subconscious that undoubtedly you're walking through life, you think you're doing okay, and then all of a sudden something happens, and then automatically you're in it. So you're like, oh, okay, there's more to do. So I just think it's not a straight path; it's a winding road, and recognizing that, then I'm always looking for the gifts of experience that bring up things that need to be dealt with. Um, it's a journey, it's a marathon, it's all those metaphors of the long haul. The other thing I heard the other day is it's a slow cooker, not a blender, right? These aren't fast processes. And so if I take the slow cooker approach, things happen, but I'm on a upward trajectory. It's just not straight. So for me, relationships are gifts to show all the things I still have to do. You know, whether it's relationships with my children, relationships with an ex-spouse, relationships with current partner, and relationships in the workplace, and all those types of things. Relationships and interacting with people is the true way to determine where am I at in this process.
Yeah. Do you have this term rumble strips? Does the word rumble strips mean anything to you?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, like the barriers. It's like the barrier at the side of the road that keeps us
Yep,
kind of
buried
on the
by the
track.
road or something to signal a big turn in the road or something that they might put there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in context of what we're talking about, can you elaborate on how you've heard that used in this space?
Yeah, the rumble strips. So the anger is a rumble strip.
Yep.
But I actually prefer your metaphor. You've said that anger is a teacher.
Hmm.
Um, and you've said relationships give us gifts. So,
Yeah.
if we could say, you know, what's his name? Gabor Mate has the wisdom of trauma. What if we could have the gift of trauma?
Yeah, and there's big T's, little T's, and I just think that everybody has had some form of adverse events in their life that has left the imprints. And you can see it in the interactions with people. You can see it when there's a reaction from somebody to a circumstance that's a little bit bigger than what the circumstance seems to be called for. And here's like one of the biggest things that I had revelation on was the notion of childhood emotional neglect. And there's an author of a book. Her name's Jonice Webb, and she wrote a book called Running on Empty. And this was like when you would talk to someone and say, "Hey, well, my childhood was fine. I think everything was fine." And yet you ask, "Well, tell me more." Well, my parents got divorced, but they still loved me. And, you had all these other incidents. You say, well, childhood emotional neglect is not about what happened as much as what didn't happen. So part of it is to have clarity of like when you say fine, but yet you had these different types of challenges, it would be really challenging for you or any of us to come out of those types of circumstances without some imprint of trauma, big T trauma, small t trauma. The complex stuff becomes more like that veiny stuff that runs through the soil because it's like it's not really significant, but it's omnipresent. And so for me, so much of it is to just say, how do I understand my past better? And how do I dig below the surface like a little bit? It's like an archaeological project where you just kind of look at for all those hidden artifacts and to then have kind of self-compassion and to have compassion for others, to recognize that when I saw my adoptive parents as something other than my parents and I saw them as humans that had their own circumstances, my whole perspective on my childhood shifted and changed. And as I've gotten to understand the history of my biological parents, my whole perspective on their circumstance has shifted to allow me to see all of it in a way that I don't hold so much anger and resentment. I say they all did the best they could at the time with what they had.
Yeah. I heard somebody say it's never too late for a totally new childhood. Um,
Yeah.
and that's what you seem to be summing up, right?
And not everybody involved in the dynamics of my journey is on that page, right? I had a reunion with the biological mother that went through that honeymoon phase that then ended with a secondary rejection and um, basically closing the door to any further relationship. And 4 years later, I get introduced through ancestry to her brother, my uncle, just this year. And now I have a relationship with him. And I now understand her life way more clearly than I did in the interactions that I had with her. And I met her prior to even reading the primal wound, which is unfortunate because I just didn't understand the dynamics, wasn't ready for what I was faced with. And it was probably a very predictable ending as a result of my being naive about that. So not everybody's on the same page with looking back and saying, hey, we are all still here. We're sorry about the way things happened, but we do have now if we choose to embrace what we have in front of us.
Yeah. It's great stuff, Tim. Really great
Yeah.
stuff. Really great stuff. You really struck me with your humility, the first conversation we had, and it's coming across really loud and strong with this one. The humility and curiosity and
Yeah.
evenness, right? There's a evenness, a grounding, and it's great. I love it. Absolutely love it.
Oh, thank you. I don't think it's anything through being humbled and recognizing what I was holding on so tightly to, which was a lot of my own righteous anger. And so it's a loosening of the grip, acknowledging
Yeah.
my own, uh, I hurt people, right? So my behavior hurt different people in my life because I hadn't had the clarity, consciously of the wounds that I had. So I'm walking around basically like with a loaded gun of trauma, trying to shoot it all around, trying to protect myself. And as a result, there's casualties. And so part of that humility is to say, how do I soften? How do I accept things? And how do I then ask for forgiveness from others who unfortunately, were on the receiving end of some things that maybe hurt them. And, that's the gift of restoration and healing and continuing to submit to love, compassion, receiving all of these things that are gifts that they're all available to us. And I was closed off to a lot of this. So a lot of this is, like that last 5 years, this last 5 years of my life has been where most of the deep healing and embracing all of this and really putting down the shields of armor, putting down all that anger, and allowing the softening of my disposition and recognizing humility, letting go of pride, and a lot of things that say, okay, you're a easier person to get along with now in a lot of ways because you have put down all of the weapons.
Yeah. Wow. Is there anything else you'd like to share that I've not asked you about, Tim?
Well, I it's been a pleasure to have a chance to talk with you. And again, what is great for the adoptee community is the kind of work that you're doing to have the ability to go into the repository of interviews that you've conducted and hear things that help me personally, and I'm sure others, understand their own story, right? That's the power of telling stories. And so, like, one of the things that certainly has been important to me is how do I find those ways, those channels of sharing my own story? Because just as many stories that have been shared, there's so many others that aren't in the healing process, that are stuck in the what I would call the darkness and struggling. You know, there's an overrepresentation of adoptees or people who've had lots of significant trauma in addiction clinics and things like that. And so the power of telling stories, the power of sharing what's available to anybody if they loosen the grip on those hurts, because we all have them. So the community you've established through what you're doing is amazing, and I'm happy to have found it. I'm happy to have made this connection, and I think for me, finding my purpose is now the next part of my journey here, and it is to kind of help other people who aren't at the same part of their journey as I am. And so, like you, giving back to this community is pretty important.
Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. Thanks, listeners. And if people want to get in touch with you, what should they do?
Yeah. So I'm starting, I have a website called prodigalpathways.com. I'm starting to do some blogging there. Um, and they can reach me on that website.
Great.
And I'm going through a life coaching course right now, taking all of what I've learned and looking at ways in which I can get into coaching and consulting to kind of help others. Prodigalpathways.com is a place that's just getting off the ground, and that's where I'm gonna start posting more, doing some more blogging, and I've got a book outline, and so I'm working on that as well. So, unlike some other guests that have already done those things, I'm in the path of kind of putting all this together and saying, how do I put all this together in a meaningful way that could be a resource for people?
Cool. Fantastic. And there's links to the website in the show notes, listeners, if you're doing like I do when I'm listening to podcasts, I'm driving or I'm walking the dog. I don't have a pen handy. So, or ironing, right? I like to say that as some kind of domestic god, right? That's the only thing I ever do around the house is sometimes a bit of ironing. So, thanks, Tim. Thanks, listeners. And we'll speak to you very soon. Take care. Bye bye.
All right.